Welcome to the deep dive. So imagine this. You're born at the exact moment news hits that an enemy fleet is sailing up your coast, about to invade.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite an image.
That was Thomas Hobbes, the Spanish Armada, 1588. The story goes, the shock sent his mother into early labor, and he later said, "Fear and I were born twins."
It's a almost legendary start for a philosopher, isn't it? And it's so important because that feeling, that fear, it wasn't just personal. Hobbes grew up in, well, incredibly turbulent times.
The English Civil War.
Exactly. That tore his world apart. And that backdrop, the chaos, the insecurity, it really shaped everything he thought about. Well, human nature, government, everything.
Yeah, he's a huge figure in political thought, often controversial, definitely. But his ideas are just foundational for how we think about the state, about individual rights even if we end up disagreeing with them.
Absolutely. Point of departure, maybe.
Right. So today we're taking a deep dive into his whole system. It's complex. His view of human nature, his, well, unique scientific approach, and why he pushed so hard for absolute sovereignty. The Leviathan.
And we're doing this deep dive with some help. We're drawing on source material, specifically some really insightful analysis from a text on Western political thought.
So think of this as a shortcut for you, the listener. We're pulling out the key insights, the really important bits from expert analysis on Hobbes.
Yeah, helping you understand what made him tick, why he thought what he thought, and crucially, why his ideas still pack such a punch today. Still provocative,
Okay, so I'll be your guide here, asking the questions, trying to navigate these big ideas, pointing out maybe where things get tricky or really interesting.
And I've got the analysis here, trying to make sure we nail the nuances and see the bigger picture, the connections.
All right, let's dive in. We need to unpack Hobbes's world first, then that intellectual revolution that really fired him up, how we built that mechanical view of humans, and then how that all leads to his big theory, the social contract and the absolute sovereign.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so Hobbes's world, more than just that dramatic birth story with the Armada. He lived in a Europe that was just steeped in violence, right, after the Protestant Reformation.
Oh, completely. The Reformation, Luther kicking it off in 1517, it wasn't just arguing about religion. It totally shook the foundations of the old order.
How so?
Well, these new doctrines, they emphasize scripture, right, and a direct personal relationship with God that massively undercut the authority of the church, the pope, the whole traditional structure.
And it didn't stay just about religion for long.
Not at all. The political fallout was immense. Protestantism basically gave monarchs a justification, an excuse almost, to break free from Rome.
Right, like Henry VIII in England.
Exactly. Declare yourself head of the church, grab church lands, consolidate power. It was a huge step towards creating these modern nation states with power centralized in the hands of the monarch.
Now, England's path after the Reformation, it was a bit different at first, wasn't it? Less immediate bloodshed than, say, Germany or France.
True. Initially less violent, but the tensions, they were definitely simmering beneath the surface, and they boiled over later. You saw these clashes emerge between sort of mainstream Protestants who were generally okay with the monarch having authority over the church.
Because that meant more centralized power for the king.
Right, and then you had the more radical groups. The Puritans are the famous example.
Who started out just wanting to purify the Church of England, get rid of the leftover Catholic bits.
Yeah, but the logic of their beliefs pushed them further. If your conscience, your reading of the Bible, is the ultimate guide in faith, then where does the king get off telling you how to worship?
Yeah, I see.
So they started arguing for limits on state power, especially in religion. And eventually, this led them to argue they had a right to resist authority if they thought it was, unlawful or against God's will.
And that's the ideological fuel for the English Civil War.
That's the core of it. You have the royalists backing the king, often using arguments about divine right, versus the parliamentarians who were heavily influenced by these Puritan ideas about limited government, consent, religious freedom.
Parliamentarians won, king executed, Cromwell's republic.
Which didn't last long. Then the restoration of the monarchy. But the argument wasn't settled. It took the Glorious Revolution later in 1688 to really cement Parliament's authority and set England on that path towards constitutional government.
And Hobbes, where did he land in all this mess?
Hobbes was firmly, unshakably on the side of absolute monarchy. He detested the Puritan revolutionaries. He saw their ideas about limiting power, about the right to resist. He saw that as the direct cause of the chaos and bloodshed he lived through.
But it's not just about which side he picked politically.
No, his practical politics are less important. historically speaking, than the philosophy he built to defend his position, the method he used, the language. That's what was truly revolutionary. He basically invented a new way to analyze politics.
So, surrounded by all this fear, this political and religious chaos, he turns to a completely different kind of revolution for answers.
Precisely. The scientific revolution. That was the only revolution Hobbes seemed to support fully his whole life. He saw it as the way to find real, stable knowledge.
And this scientific revolution was about a whole new way of knowing the world, wasn't it? Getting away from just reading old books.
Totally. A huge shift. Instead of relying on classical authorities, especially Aristotle, whose ideas totally dominated universities, then the focus turned to direct observation, experiments, empirical data. Looking at the world scientifically, as it is, not through the lens of ancient texts or predetermined ideas about its purpose. Hobbes himself apparently hated the old Aristotelian stuff he had to study at Oxford.
And Galileo Galilei, he was huge for Hobbes.
Absolutely pivotal. Decisive, even. Galileo's discoveries were amazing, of course, like backing up Copernicus, showing the Earth wasn't the center of everything. But for Hobbes, it was Galileo's method that was the real game changer.
Oh, though.
Galileo tried to understand the physical world without bringing in theology, without asking why things existed in a purposeful teleological sense. He just looked at matter, at motion, and described it mathematically. No divine plan needed in the physics.
And Hobbes thought, I can do that for politics.
That was the flash of brilliance. He took that non-teleological, empirical, scientific method and just applied it straight to human beings, to politics. He believed he could create a political science as rigorous, as certain as Galileo's physics.
The source uses that interesting comparison. Machiavelli was like the Copernicus of politics, and Hobbes was the Galileo.
It's a great analogy. Machiavelli made that first revolutionary step right. Looking at politics realistically, how power actually works, not how it should work according to some ideal moral code, he cleared the ground. Then Hobbes comes along and brings this powerful new method, Galileo's scientific method, to bear on that realistic subject. He wanted to understand the sort of underlying mechanics of it all.
There's a real irony here, though. Europe's tearing itself apart over religion, and Hobbes is embracing an intellectual revolution that's basically making religion irrelevant.
Yeah.
At least for science.
The irony is deep. He's defending absolute monarchy, which traditionally leaned on religious arguments like the divine right of kings. But Hobbes defends it using the language of the new science, a language that just had no place for divine right or God's will as a political explanation.
So he ended up annoying everyone.
Pretty much. He alienated the Puritans with his conclusions, defending the king, but he often alienated the Royalists too, because his justification wasn't based on God, it was based on this cold scientific logic of power.
So the Royalists and Puritans, fighting each other to the death, actually had more in common in their basic assumptions rooted in religion than either had with Hobbes.
Fundamentally, yes. They were arguing about whose interpretation of God's will was right. Hobbes just stepped outside that whole frame, and that's exactly why, especially after he published Leviathan, people widely suspected him of being an atheist, which was a huge deal back then. His materialism just didn't leave much room for traditional religious belief.
Okay, so if we really want to get Hobbes's political theory, we have to start with this scientific foundation he built it on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His major work, Leviathan, from 1651, it's basically structured as this grand demonstration, showing how principles from Galilean physics can explain human psychology, and how that psychology then becomes the bedrock for a real science of politics.
And he lays it out very systematically in the book, step by step.
Oh yeah, it's a very deliberate, logical structure. He starts right at the bottom with his basic assumptions about reality, metaphysics, epistemology, how we know things. Then he builds up to physics, applies it to the world, including us. Then psychology becomes a kind of physics of the mind. And finally, from all that, he deduces his political science. You really have to follow the steps to get the argument.
Okay, step one, materialist metaphysics. What does that mean, practically?
It means reality, the universe, everything. It's made of only material stuff, physical matter. Galileo and the new scientists, they stopped trying to explain things by talking about inherent purposes or God's plan. They looked for material causes and effects, physical explanations for physical events.
Even if they were religious themselves.
Right. Even personally devout scientists understood that their science had to stick to material explanations to be objective, to be predictable. You leave God out of the scientific equation itself.
And epistemology, how we know things, was also turned upside down. Empiricism, but different.
Yeah, traditional empiricism, like Aristotle's, kind of took our senses at face value. You see red, you feel heat, that's the starting point. But the new empiricism, Galileo's and Hobbes's version, said you have to dig deeper. Reality isn't the sensation itself, it's the underlying physical cause of the sensation.
Which boils down to body and motion.
Those are the fundamental building blocks for Hobbes. Body is just mass, matter, the physical stuff. Motion is the fact that this stuff is energized, is constantly moving unless something stops it or changes its course. It connects back to ancient ideas like Democritus and atoms, but now it's part of this emerging modern scientific framework.
So reality is ultimately just mass, energy, space, time. The stuff of modern physics.
Pretty much. These concepts became the necessary common denominators. Without them, the world is just this blooming, buzzing confusion of different sensations. Plato tried to find order in non-material forms. Hobbes and the new scientists wanted a solid foundation in the material world itself.
Rejecting Plato's perfect non-material world of forms.
Completely. They wanted a science based strictly on material stuff. No appeals to imaginary perfect chairs or ideal redness. Body and motion, they thought, could provide that solid material basis.
The example about explaining color really helps make this clear.
It does. If you just rely on your subjective feeling of red, you get stuck, right? Is it crimson? Scarlet? Pinkish? Plato says there's an ideal form of redness. Hobbes says no, let's reduce it to body and motion.
Oh.
Light, which Hobbes thought of as tiny bodies or motions, hits an object. It reflects in a particular way. That light motion hits your eye, causes motion in your nerves, motion in your brain. That internal motion is the sensation, the phantasm as he called it, of red. Redness is just the word we give to that whole physical process and the resulting internal experience.
And the power of that is explaining the variations scientifically.
Exactly. Different shades of red. That's just variations in the motion of those light particles, what we now call different frequencies or wavelength. It reduces the phenomenon to the common denominators, body and motion. You don't need everyone to agree on the subjective feeling of red. If you define a certain wavelength as red, then scientifically it is red, regardless of slight personal differences in perception. It gives you a basis for objective, material truth independent of subjective experience.
Okay, fundamental reality. Body and motion. Now you need a language to describe it.
Right, a language for science. And that language had to be mathematics. Why? Because body and motion are about quantities, things you can measure.
Height, weight, speed.
Exactly. Length, density, direction, velocity, time. Modern science, built on these foundations, is fundamentally mathematical.
And what specifically grabbed Hobbes about math?
It's certainty. Mathematical truths are true by definition. We create the symbols, we create the rules. If you follow the rules logically, the conclusions have to be true within that system. Think geometry, define a circle, then all lines from center to edge must be equal. It's built into the definition.
But here's the really tricky bit philosophically. The source says scientific truth using math is about the system, our language, not necessarily about ultimate reality itself.
Yes, Hobbes got this incredibly clearly, maybe more clearly than many scientists then. Truth isn't in the things themselves, the world just is. Truth and falsehood, he said famously, are attributes of speech, not of things. Our truth claims are about the logical consistency of the language, the symbols we use to describe reality.
And this connects to nominalism, the idea that words are just labels we attach.
Precisely. A nominalist thinks words are arbitrary symbols. When we call something beautiful, beauty isn't a physical property or a platonic form. It's a word we use for a cluster of attributes that provoke a certain response in us. Understanding beauty is understanding the word and how we use it.
And Hobbes was a thoroughgoing nominalist.
He was. And this mixed materialism, only physical stuff exists, plus nominalism, we only know that stuff indirectly through our symbolic thoughts and language about it. That's really characteristic of how Hobbes saw modern science. Scientific theory is a symbolic representation, a model.
So his big insight was seeing theory as this deductive, almost geometric tool for understanding.
Yeah. Galileo really opened his eyes to that. The power of deducing how things work, from abstract principles, manipulating symbols logically, maybe even figuring out the universe, as the source puts it, sitting in a closet. That logical power was key.
Which is why he wasn't keen on Francis Bacon's approach, just collecting facts.
Right. Hobbes and Galileo saw, correctly I think, that just piling up facts isn't enough. Real scientific progress comes from theoretical breakthroughs, new ways of thinking, new mathematical tools, new symbolic languages like calculus emerging then. It's the theory, the framework, that drives understanding, not just raw data.
Okay, so that's the scientific engine. Materialism, body in motion, nominalism, deductive logic via math and language. How does he now apply this formidable toolkit to us, to human nature?
This is where it gets really, really radical. He doesn't claim new discoveries about what humans do. He offers a completely new way of looking at humans,
Yeah.
using exactly the same materialist lens, the same kind of symbolic analysis that Galileo used for planets or falling objects. Humans are just physical processes reducible to body and motion.
And from that cold view, he thinks he can logically derive a science of politics.
That's the bold claim. Understand the human machine, and you can deduce, almost like geometry, how political life must be structured to work.
He starts by dividing motion in humans into two kinds.
Yeah. First, there's vital motion. That's the involuntary stuff, breathing, blood circulating, digestion, purely physical, automatic. That's for physiology to study.
Okay.
Then there's voluntary motion. This is the stuff we will do walking, talking, interacting. Politics, social life, it all falls under this category. It's behavior, basically, and that's the subject for political science.
And psychology comes first, because you have to think or feel before you act voluntarily.
Logically, yes, voluntary actions start as internal states. Before you walk, you have to sort of will it. Before you speak, you need thoughts, language. Hobbes says knowing and willing, those are the two sides of our psychological life.
And knowing and willing are themselves just internal physical motions.
That's the crucial step. They are physical processes inside us. Motions in the brain, the body, triggered by things happening outside or inside. It sounds crude maybe, but it lines up with modern neuroscience in a way, right? Mental states as electrochemical events triggered by senses. Hobbes thought of it as like vibrations of tiny particles in the brain.
So knowing is basically translating sensory input into these internal motions and then into language.
That's the process. Your senses pick up external motion, light waves, sound waves. That causes motion inside, transmitted to the brain. The brain then reproduces these motions, these vibrations. That internal motion is the sensation, the phantasm. Then the brain sticks a label on it. This particular vibration gets called red. Then we group labels. Red is a type of color, and we build up these complex language systems we use for thinking and knowledge.
And it's this ability to label the labels, to build language systems that makes us different from animals.
Yeah, Hobbes says animals might recognize a name, like a dog knows its own name. But only humans create and manipulate these abstract systems of symbols for knowledge. Saying black is not white is a simple logical move using language that animals can't do. Math and geometry are the best systems for science because they're so abstract, so logically tight. They produce that truth of words.
But always underneath the fancy language, it's just physical stuff happening.
Always. It's a strictly material psychology. Initial cause, physical motion outside. Result, physical motion inside, brain activity. We experience the phantasm, seeing red, but the reality underneath is particles and motion.
And nominalism, again, truth is in the words, because we don't directly experience the underlying physical reality.
Exactly. Red is the word for the phantasm, the experience, not the light wave itself. Abstract words like color or beauty are even more detached. Scientific knowledge using precise language like math is about the logical consistency of our symbolic description.
Okay, that covers knowing. What about the other side, willing?
Willing is the active, desiring part, and it works on the exact same physical principles. Willing is driven by the passions, which for Hobbes are, again, just internal motions. Physical motions of particles in the body, what we might call biochemical reactions or hormonal drives today.
And these internal motions, these passions, they never stop.
Nope. Life is motion. A living thing can't be totally static. Hobbes puts it so starkly. No one can any more live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. Desire is constant, just like thinking or sensing is constant while we're alive.
And desire starts with endeavor.
Yeah, endeavor is the root. It's the basic impulse either towards something, appetite seeking pleasure, or away from something, aversion, avoiding pain. He even describes endeavor physically in one book as motion made in less space and time than can be given, trying to capture these tiny, almost instantaneous micromotions in the brain that kick off desire and action.
So the ultimate goal driving all human willing is simply maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
That's the bottom line he reaches. That's the fundamental drive behind everything we voluntarily do.
And this leads to his famous definition of the will.
As the last appetite in deliberation.
The last appetite.
Meaning, when you're weighing options, considering the potential pleasures and pains of different actions, the will is simply whichever desire or aversion finally wins out. the one that has the strongest pull based on that internal calculation of pleasure-pain. It's not a free choice in the classical sense. It's determined by the strongest impulse.
So it's basically utilitarian psychology, behavior driven by a pleasure-pain calculus.
It is, and this is where he makes another huge break with someone like Socrates.
Socrates thought if you knew the good, you'd automatically want it. Knowledge comes first.
Right, Hobbes flips it completely. You will something first, whatever you think will bring pleasure or avoid pain. Then you use your reason, your knowledge, as a tool to figure out how to get it. Intellect serves the passions. Desire drives the train.
So human happiness, felicity as he calls it, is just getting pleasure.
For Hobbes, yeah. Felicity is pleasure. And because desire never ends, felicity isn't some final state of bliss you reach. It's a continuous process, a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. You get one thing, you enjoy it, but that just opens up the next desire.
So all our actions are basically aimed at getting and keeping a contented life, defined as maximizing pleasure.
That's the argument. The voluntary actions tend not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of a contented life. Now, what specific things people find pleasurable might differ wildly based on culture or personality.
Right. He distinguishes between the objects of desire and the desire itself.
Exactly. What an Australian Aborigine desires might be different from what a Frenchman desires, as the source notes, but that underlying relentless drive for pleasure, for felicity, that's natural.
Yeah.
It's biological, innate in all humans.
And amidst all this variety, there's one thing everyone desires because it's the key to getting whatever else they desire.
Power. This is the crucial link between his psychology and his politics. Power is the universal means to achieve felicity, however you happen to define it. Logically, Hobbes argues you can't want an end, felicity, without also wanting the means, power, to get it.
Which leads us to maybe his most famous and perhaps most chilling quote about human nature.
A perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. And for Hobbes, this isn't a moral judgment, it's a strict logical deduction. If desire is limitless, the desire for the means to satisfy desire power must also be limitless.
And it's not just about wanting more pleasure, but often just protecting the power you already have.
That's a key part of the logic. You can't assure your current level of well-being, your present means to live well, without acquiring more power. Why? Because everyone else is also seeking power, and their quest constantly threatens your position. It's this relentless logic of power that shapes human interaction.
So, the picture Hobbes paints is pretty stark. We're desiring machines, power-seeking animals, fundamentally self-interested, using reason as a tool for our own ends, and basically, if left alone, antisocial.
That's the inescapable conclusion of his whole psychological analysis. It sounds a bit like St. Augustine's view of flawed human nature, but the huge difference is Hobbes's framework is entirely secular materialist.
Right. He says desires aren't sins in themselves.
Yes, the desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. From his scientific viewpoint, assigning moral blame makes no sense. If we're biologically determined to maximize pleasure driven by physical emotions, how can you blame someone for acting according to their nature? There's no real choice involved in that moral sense.
And that's the really revolutionary part, the denial of free will.
It follows directly from reducing everything to determined body in motion. It completely dismantles the classical idea of freedom based on rational moral choice. Hobbes says flat out, neither is the freedom of willing or not willing greater in man than in other living creatures.
So even our voluntary actions are determined, just like our heartbeat.
In his view, yes. We think we're making free choices, but they're determined by that last appetite, the strongest push towards pleasure, or away from pain in that moment of deliberation. Even choosing to be, say, a saint versus a sinner, Hobbes would argue, is based on which path you calculate will bring greater long-term pleasure or avoid greater long-term pain.
Wow. Okay. That's the foundation, this rather stark, scientific, mechanical view of human nature. How does he build his political theory on top of that?
He moves from those internal motions psychology to the outward expressions of voluntary motion, which is human interaction, behavior, and society. Political science studies these outward forms, and that view of humans as self-interested, power-seeking beings directly shapes his central political concept, the social contract.
The idea that government, the state, it's created by an agreement between people.
Yes. And the legitimate powers of that government are set by the terms of this agreement, this contract. The source compares it to forming a business. The state is the abstract entity created by contract. The government is like the management that runs it.
And the huge implication is that authority comes from the people's consent.
Exactly. The state is legitimate only because people mutually agreed to create it. That's incredibly modern, right? Completely throws out the old medieval idea of divine right, which the royalists were still defending. Consent contract theory was a radical alternative.
And this contract idea gives Hobbes a way to analyze the state scientifically.
It does, because if you assume a contract, you can logically work backward to imagine the situation before the contract.
Yeah.
The state of nature.
The condition with no government, no laws, no society, really.
Right, a hypothetical baseline. What would humans be like? How would they behave if they were completely unconstrained by any external authority? It's a way to see human nature raw, as it really is, without the varnish of civilization.
And this state of nature idea ties into his scientific method too, right? The resolutive method.
Yeah, it complements his main compositive method. Compositive starts with principles, body, motion, power seeking, and deduces effects, state of war. Resolutive works backward. Look at the effects, behavior in the state of nature, and analyze them to deduce the underlying causes or principles, innate power thirst. The state of nature thought experiment helps confirm his psychological theory.
But he didn't think this was a real historical period, like cavemen or something.
No, he was clear on that. Even primitive societies have rules, structure. The state of nature is a mental construct, an intellectual act. It's a tool for analysis, not history.
And the source basically asks us, the listener, to try this thought experiment ourselves.
Yeah, seriously imagine. What if, right now, all government, laws, police just vanished? How would you act? How would everyone else act? What happens next?
And in that situation, you'd have two conditions: absolute liberty and absolute equality.
Right, absolute liberty, because with no laws, you have a right to everything. You can do literally anything you think helps you survive or get what you want. And absolute equality, because, fundamentally, humans are roughly equal in strength and smarts. Anyone can potentially harm anyone else. Big inequalities are social creations, not natural facts.
And those two conditions, liberty and equality, inevitably lead to conflict.
Hobbes says it's unavoidable, a constant, brutal struggle for power. If everyone has a right to everything and everyone's roughly equal, you're always vulnerable. Your right to everything includes the right to attack others if you think it's necessary. With no rules, no authority, self-preservation dictates a kind of preemptive aggression. It's like a twisted golden rule. Do unto others before they do unto you.
Which leads to his famous line, out of civil states, there is always war of everyone against everyone.
Exactly. The state of nature is the state of war. And he doesn't just mean constant fighting. He means the constant fear of violence, the perpetual insecurity, the lack of trust.
And here's that paradox we talked about earlier.
Yeah. The very drive for felicity, for pleasure and security leads to this state of war where felicity is impossible. Because everyone's equal enough, no one can win decisively, but because everyone's driven by self-interest, the struggle never stops. Life is just constant fear.
Which brings us to possibly the most famous, most brutal description in all of political philosophy.
That unforgettable passage about what life is like without government. No place for industry, no culture, no navigation, no commodious building, no knowledge, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
It's just bleak, utterly pessimistic.
Viscerally so. But Hobbes insists it's the logical, unavoidable truth if you're honest about human nature without constraints. We'd destroy any chance of civilization. It proves for him that we're naturally antisocial. Niceness is just a result of control.
What about people who disagree, who say humans are naturally good, cooperative, that the state of nature would be peaceful?
Hobbes basically says they haven't thought it through properly. They haven't honestly looked inside themselves. They haven't done the work of reading mankind in their own hearts. He says anyone who governs has to read in himself, not this or that particular man, but mankind.
He actually thinks people resist this truth about themselves.
Oh, yeah. He argues critics don't want to admit the state of nature is war because they don't want to admit their own potential for selfishness, their own egoism, their own power-seeking desires bubbling under the surface. It's uncomfortable. Like psychological resistance, you cling to a flattering self-image. The lie feels better.
But he uses people's everyday actions against them, doesn't he? To show they secretly agree with him.
It's a brilliant point. He says, look at how you actually behave. You lock your doors at night. You lock your chests. You arm yourself when you travel. And you do this even though there are laws and police. His punchline is basically, does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? Your actions betray your real beliefs about human nature.
So for Hobbes, it's undeniable. We are by nature antisocial power seekers. The logic confirms it, experience concerns it, our own behavior confirms it.
That's his bedrock conclusion. And once you accept that truth, he believes you can finally build a realistic, scientific theory of politics.
Okay, so for contract theorists, this boils down to two big questions, right? Why leave the state of nature, and what are the terms of the deal? Or, why have a state at all, and what powers should it have?
Exactly. And the answer to why leave comes straight from that nightmare vision of the state of nature. People agree to create a state to get peace, to escape the war of all against all. It's the only rational way to survive, let alone have a chance at achieving any kind of felicity, any security from constant fear.
So the state's job number one is security. It's not about making people morally better like Plato or Aristotle thought.
No, that's a massive shift from classical thought. For Hobbes, the state exists purely to protect people from each other and from outside threats. Moral education. Forget it. Given his view of human nature, rapacious, self-interested people can't be fundamentally made better. They can only be stopped from harming each other. The state's job is practical, not moralistic.
But doesn't he talk about a law of nature to seek peace? That sounds kind of moral.
It seems like a contradiction, but it's not, because Hobbes completely redefines natural law. He says it's a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life.
So it's not a divine moral command, it's just rational self-preservation. A rule reason tells you if you want to stay alive.
Exactly. It's practical reason applied to the problem of survival. How best to maximize your own self-interest, primarily the interest in not dying violently.
Which means, for Hobbes, morality and self-interest are basically the same thing.
That's the radical move. It completely breaks from the traditional natural law thinkers. He turns it into a kind of naturalistic ethics deriving ought from is, from how humans actually behave based on their psychological drives. Pleasure pain. You seek peace because war is painful, not because peace is objectively good. The whole natural law tradition really struggles after Hobbes twists it like this.
So practically speaking, people contract out of the state of nature driven by pure self-interest, the desire for security.
That's the engine. Which brings us to the second question. What powers does the government need to provide that security? What are the terms of the contract?
Well, if security is the absolute goal, the government needs enough power to guarantee it.
Which, for Hobbes, logically means absolute power. Anything less, any limitation creates a loophole for self-interested individuals to exploit, risking a collapse back into chaos. The power must be sufficient, and sufficient means absolute.
So the deal is, everyone hands over all their power to the government, and individuals only have whatever rights the government allows them.
That's his conclusion. No legitimate limits on the sovereign power.
And he argues the very process of making the contract shows why this has to be the case.
Yeah, he describes that moment of creation, quote, as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition that thou give up thy right to him. It's this mutual transfer of the right to self-governance that creates the sovereign power.
Everyone lays down their right to do whatever they want and gives it to a common power.
Yes, and crucially, Hobbes insists they must give up all their power and strength unto one will, not just some powers, because right and power are basically the same for him. If individuals hold back significant power, you don't get that single unified sovereign will needed to keep the peace. The logic of the contract itself demands total transfer of power to create the sovereign.
And sovereignty means ultimate authority, the final say.
Exactly, ultimate power. Domestically, the sovereign state is the final authority, above the church, above individual conscience. Hobbes was very concerned about those potential sources of conflict. Internationally, states are autonomous.
But sovereignty is the abstract idea. Government is the actual entity holding the power.
Right. Sovereignty is the word for the state's supreme power. The government, a king, an assembly, is the group that actually wields that power effectively.
Okay, but this is where most people push back, right? Why on earth would self-interested power seekers agree to give up all their power? Why not keep some basic rights speech, religion? That's the whole idea behind constitutional limits on government.
And Hobbes just completely rejects that. He thinks constitutionalism is based on a fantasy about human nature. People can't be trusted with retained power. They'll inevitably use it to undermine the government for their own gain, leading back to the state of nature. To be truly sovereign, the power transfer must be total.
But why would they consent to that?
Because the alternative, the state of nature, is infinitely worse. The fear and pain of that condition are so overwhelming that giving up your rights to an absolute sovereign is the lesser of two evils. It's the rational choice driven by the last appetite, avoiding the greatest pain. Self-interest compels consent.
And here's that crucial point.
Yeah.
The contract is between the people themselves, not between the people and the government.
Absolutely critical. The sovereign is the recipient of the power transferred, not a party to the initial agreement. If the government were a party to the contract, that would imply limitations, obligations on the government. And limited government, for Hobbes, just can't work given human nature. It's logically doomed to fail.
So consent is a funny thing here. It's not ongoing agreement, but obedience based on self-interest.
Pretty much. They consent to the creation of the sovereign by contracting with each other. Once the sovereign exists, they consent to obey its laws because the alternative, punishment or worse, a return to chaos, is against their self-interest. This applies whether the sovereign came to power through agreement or just by conquest. You obey the power that exists because it's rational to do so.
And law, then, is just the sovereign's command, backed by force.
Fundamentally, yes, order requires rules, but rules are useless without enforcement. Law needs power. Law is command. As he famously said, covenants without the sword are but words. People obey out of compulsion, fear of consequences, not some inner moral sense. Natural law isn't really law in this political sense because it lacks the sword.
Which leads directly to the biggest objection. If the sovereign is absolute and defines justice, can't it just make terrible, immoral laws and force people to obey? Doesn't this justify tyranny? The constitutionalist says power must be limited to prevent this.
That's the heart of the challenge, isn't it? And it's the argument people like Locke will pick up later.
Hobbes's first defense is practical. Tyranny might be bad, but anarchy is worse.
Right. He basically says, look, there's always a risk with absolute power. But the risk of a limited government collapsing into civil war because people will exploit those limits is far, far greater. Absolute sovereignty is the necessary price for peace. You can't limit it without risking everything.
But he has a much deeper, more fundamental response based on his whole theory of knowledge, doesn't he? About morality itself.
Exactly. He argues that from a scientific perspective, there's no such thing as an objectively immoral law in some absolute Platonic sense. Morality, justice, injustice. These are just words we use to describe things. Remember, truth is in speech, not in things. Justice is just a word.
So whoever has the power, the sovereign gets to define what that word justice means within their state.
Precisely. When the sovereign legislates, its laws are by definition just because the sovereign is the entity we authorized, through our mutual contract, to make those definitions. To call the sovereign's law unjust is, for Hobbes, a logical contradiction. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 5 within the rules of arithmetic we agreed on.
He's applying that scientific nominalist view directly to politics.
Just like Galileo defined red by wavelength, Hobbes defines justice by the sovereign's decree. The definition flows logically from the concept of sovereignty. Any other definition of justice violates the logical rules of the system, the truth of words, and is therefore scientifically false by his standards. The constitutionalist objection, appealing to some inherent objective justice that limits the sovereign, is simply scientifically incoherent in Hobbes's framework.
And he thinks people who make those objections are really just arguing out of self-interest. They want power for themselves.
Yes. He dismisses such criticisms as reflecting a tincture of our different passions. It's political maneuvering, not principled objection. People wrap their desire for power after power in the language of justice or rights, but really, they just want to be the ones calling the shots.
He saw language itself as a political battleground, easily misused.
Absolutely. Humans twist words like justice, liberty, equality to suit their own interests. That's why political agreement is so hard. Everyone defines the key terms differently based on their own stake in the outcome. Think about equality. Does it mean equal property? That sounds good if you're poor, bad if you're rich. For Hobbes, this means you need a sovereign power to impose common definitions and enforce them. Shared understanding doesn't arise naturally. It has to be created and maintained by power.
And this really highlights that shift in modern political thought, starting with Machiavelli, cemented by Hobbes.
Yes. The loss of belief in objective ethical truths means political concepts get redefined purely in terms of power. Power becomes the key variable. Law is command because there's no higher moral standard it needs to conform to.
And this applies to ideas like liberty and equality, too. They become power concepts.
Totally. Classical liberty might be about virtue or rational self-rule. For Hobbes, liberty is simply the absence of external obstacles, freedom to exercise your power. In the state of nature, it's unlimited power, limited only by others. In society, your power, rights, is limited by law, which is just the sovereign's power, no inherent ethical content. Same with equality. Aristotle might talk about proportional equality based on merit. Hobbes talks about the raw equality of power, roughly equal ability to harm, equal desire for pleasure. Again, it's an equation of power, not ethics.
So Hobbes's achievement is this incredibly coherent, if chilling, system built from materialism, utilitarian psychology, and scientific language theory, resulting in a politics purely about power and self-interest.
Yes, it's an amazing intellectual construction, a radical rejection of the classical view, and incredibly influential. You see echoes in law, linguistics, psychology, not just political science. People had to react to Hobbes.
And where do we see his shadow looming largest today?
Well, one very clear area is international relations, the realist school of thought. They often explicitly use Hobbes to describe the global scene.
As a state of nature.
Pretty much. No world government, no effective international law with teeth. So states, like individuals in the state of nature, act purely out of self-interest, national interest, constantly jockeying for power. It's a perpetual power struggle, a chronic state of potential or actual war.
And the realist solution, if any, sounds Hobbesian too.
It does. Real peace would only come if states gave up their sovereign powers to a world government, a global leviathan. Mutual disarmament would be a logical step, but just like Hobbes argued individuals wouldn't unilaterally disarm, realists say states won't, others would just take advantage.
But most realists are pretty skeptical about a world government actually happening.
Generally, yes. They see the best hope as a fragile balance of power, which still leaves conflict possible. If states do cooperate, realists tend to attribute it to fear of war, fear of mutual destruction, rather than some emerging global morality. It's still power politics, driven by self-interest and fear.
And things like the UN. Realists see that as.
Often as a prime example of Hobbesian failure. States keep their sovereignty, the UN lacks real enforcement power, its resolutions are just words. So the international state of war continues, basically.
This Hobbesian lens isn't just for international affairs anymore, though. You mentioned neo-Hobbesianism, looking at domestic politics.
Yeah, there's a growing trend there. The argument is that even within seemingly stable societies, the underlying reality is still Hobbesian. Civil order depends entirely on the state maintaining its sovereign power, its ability to command and enforce. The state of nature is always lurking just beneath the surface.
It may be harder to see that in a liberal democracy, where people feel they have rights and are part of the system.
True. But the neo-Hobbesian view distinguishes the form of government, democracy, from the underlying fact of state sovereignty, power. As long as the government, democratic or not, can enforce its laws, the state is sovereign. Hobbes preferred monarchy, but he knew sovereignty could exist in other forms. Some later thinkers even argued democracy could be a very effective tool for social control, strengthening sovereignty.
So things like constitutional rights aren't seen as fundamental limits on power, but as things the state allows.
That's the neo-Hobbesian take, yeah. Our constitutional rights don't truly constrain the state's ultimate power. They're granted and can be withdrawn when the state feels its security or order is threatened. We like to think they're absolute, but history shows, in crises wartime, major unrest civil liberties often get curtailed. That's the sovereign power showing itself.
And some thinkers are applying this to current anxieties about, say, economic decline.
Yes. The argument goes something like this. The era of easy affluence is ending. Scarcity creates conflict over resources, limiting people's ability to satisfy those endless desires Hobbes talked about. This breeds unrest, pushing society closer to a state of nature. And in response, the state will inevitably assert its power more forcefully, curbing liberties to maintain order. It's a way of saying crisis reveals the Hobbesian truth. Power is king, and only a strong state can save us.
Okay, that's a pretty stark trajectory. But there's a twist, isn't there? A seeming contradiction in Hobbes himself about how much the state should actually do.
There is. It's quite paradoxical. He argued for absolute sovereign power, the right to do anything. But he didn't argue for the sovereign to constantly meddle in people's lives. He thought the sovereign needn't interfere in most areas.
Which areas did he think should be left relatively free?
He lists things like buying and selling, making contracts, choosing where you live, what you eat, your job, how you educate your kids. Basically, the sphere of private life and economic activity.
So despite the absolute power, he's not advocating for totalitarianism.
Definitely not. This is a really important distinction. Hobbes is not the ancestor of modern totalitarian states that try to control everything. Actually, by arguing for a state focused mainly on providing security and order and leaving other spheres, especially the economy, largely free, he helped lay the groundwork for the liberal theory of the negative state.
The negative state government mainly stays out, just maintains the rules of the game.
Exactly. Its job is mainly to stop you from harming others or breaking the peace, not to dictate your whole life or pursue some grand collective project.
And he saw the very act of concentrating power in the state as potentially liberating for the individual.
Yes, that's a fascinating insight. By creating one powerful sovereign, you strip power away from all those other authorities that used to dominate medieval life lords, guilds, the church. The individual is left, relatively speaking, freer from all those intermediate layers of control, facing just the one, albeit absolute sovereign. Centralization, paradoxically, could enable liberty.
So the sovereign state provides the framework, and the negative state allows freedom within it.
Right. And this system isn't held together just by the threat of force. Hobbes knew that wouldn't work long term.
It's held together by mutual self-interest.
Yes. People obey primarily because it's in their interest to do so. They avoid punishment, sure. But more importantly, the system provides the peace and security they need to pursue their own private interests, especially making money, getting ahead. They have a stake in the system working.
And the sovereign also has a self-interest in not overstepping.
Absolutely. If the sovereign becomes too oppressive, interferes too much, it undermines the very reason people consented in the first place. Security, ability to pursue felicity, that risks rebellion. So it's in the sovereign's own interest to exercise restraint, particularly in areas like the economy, to keep the population supportive, or at least quiescent.
Okay, so we have this complex picture. Absolute power in theory, but potentially limited interference in practice, held together by self-interest. But now we get to what the source suggests is the deepest criticism, the potential fatal flaw.
Right. The argument that, despite its immense theoretical power, Hobbes's Leviathan is ultimately weak because it lacks genuine authority.
We talked about this distinction. Power gets obedience through force or calculation of self-interest. Authority gets obedience because people feel they ought to obey, an inner sense of legitimacy or moral rightness.
Exactly. And the criticism is that Hobbes's sovereign relies only on power. And mere power, mere calculation of self-interest, is ultimately too thin, too brittle to hold a society together, especially through hard times. The political theorist Sheldon Wolin called Hobbes's power concept hollow because it lacks that deeper buy-in, that active support rooted in something more than fear or gain.
Even Machiavelli, the ultimate power politician, seemed to get the need for something more, right? Like patriotism or civic virtue.
Yes. Machiavelli knew you needed to cultivate those feelings, love of country, shared purpose, even if he saw them as useful illusions. They provide a basis for authority, for people wanting to contribute, to sacrifice, beyond just their immediate self-interest.
But Hobbes, with his radical materialism and nominalism, seemed to strip away even those illusions from the people themselves.
That's the crux of the critique. By grounding everything human nature, the state purely in mechanical self-interest, in the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, he trains citizens to view their connection to the state in purely instrumental terms. You obey as long as it delivers the goods, ensures your private felicity. There's no foundation for loyalty based on moral principle or shared identity.
And that's the system's vulnerability.
That's the argument. If the sovereign stops delivering, if the economy tanks, if security breaks down, what reason is there left to obey? Self-interest would then dictate resistance, or at least withdrawal of support. The sovereign can't appeal to some higher purpose, some common good, because the whole system was explicitly built without one. It has disarmed itself, ethically speaking.
And this isn't just some old philosophical debate. It's seen as highly relevant to modern politics, especially in the West.
Very much so. The argument is that Western democracies, particularly the U.S., have largely adopted Hobbesian assumptions about self-interest being the primary motivator, about law being command, about power being the bottom line. But this creates a potential internal weakness. The state might look powerful externally, but lacks the deep, unifying authority needed to weather real crises. Shar, mentioned in the source, talks about this decline of authority having Hobbesian roots.
Applying it to the U.S. specifically.
The argument is that the U.S. model increasingly emphasizes individual self-interest, especially economic gain, within a framework of law, rather than a strong sense of shared public community or purpose. Affluence becomes the glue. If affluence falters, if scarcity bites, that self-interested bond weakens, potentially leading to social fragmentation, conflict, that Hobbesian war of all against all creeping back in. This connects to the neo-Hobbesian idea that state force has to increase as the economic basis for consent erodes.
It's a worrying thought. And this deep problem of authority in Hobbes seems tied to the very foundations of modern science that he embraced.
It seems to be. The fundamental question becomes, if the universe is just matter in motion, purposeless, accidental, and if our language can't grasp objective values or ultimate truth, where do you find any basis for ethical principles, for the ought that underpins authority? Where is Plato's objective good in a purely material world?
And Hobbes' answer within his own system is, it doesn't exist.
No. He's brutally consistent. There is no finis ultimus, nor summum bonum. No ultimate end, no greatest good in the classical sense, no objective ethical purpose to life or politics, only subjective desires and power struggles.
So the scientific revolution, championed by Hobbes by focusing only on material cause and effect, effectively sidelined the very concepts virtue, common good, objective morality that classical theories relied on for authority.
That's the consequence, according to this critique. If the state is just a power-managing machine and humans are just pleasure-pain calculators, the language of ethics, of virtue, loses its meaning. And if you can't talk meaningfully about virtue or objective good, how can you build a theory of authority that rests on anything more solid than force and self-interest?
So the challenge for political thought after Hobbes has been trying to figure out how to get authority back, how to reunite ethics and politics within this modern scientific worldview.
That's the huge ongoing dilemma, and the thinkers who followed, like John Locke, perhaps a topic for another deep dive, were grappling directly with this, trying to find a way to secure rights and justify government legitimacy on grounds perhaps more stable than Hobbes offered, laying groundwork that heavily influenced the American founders.
Well, it was definitely a deep dive into Thomas Hobbes. We saw how his personal experience of fear, combined with the intellectual earthquake of the scientific revolution, led him to this stark materialist view of humans as self-interested power seekers.
And we followed his relentless logic, showing why he thought only an all-powerful sovereign, the Leviathan, could save us from a life that was nasty, brutish, and short. A complete break from how people had thought about politics for centuries.
Yeah, but we also explored the profound challenge his system faces this problem of authority. If it's all just power and calculated self-interest, what really holds us together? Is fear and the pursuit of private gain enough, especially when times get tough?
It leaves us with a really fundamental question, one that feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? If Hobbes is even partly right about our underlying nature, and if our modern world increasingly reflects that focus on individual gain and material well-being, well, how fragile is the whole enterprise? What provides the glue, the shared sense of ought, if objective values are off the table?
A question to definitely keep pondering. What could possibly provide that missing glue in a world seen so much through a materialist lens?
Indeed. The question lingers.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Thomas Hobbes.